It started with a trash can left out overnight, a minor oversight. But in a neighborhood ruled by a ruthless HOA, that simple mistake became a spark. What followed wasn't just a fine, it was war. And this time, the board picked the wrong family to fight. The Lettertha house stood at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, a modest two-story with weathered shutters, a neat lawn, and a driveway that had seen its fair share of oil stains and chalk drawings. It was not the kind of house one would expect to become the center of a neighborhood war, nor the kind of family one would expect to become the target of an HOA board with far too much time and power on its hands. Yet it all began with a simple piece of paper slipped into the mailbox, folded neatly inside an envelope stamped with the HOAS official crest. At first glance, it didn't seem like much, just another routine communication from the association that governed every hedge, mailbox, and roof shingle in the neighborhood. But as the envelope was torn open and the words inside came into view, the tone was unmistakable. It wasn't friendly. It wasn't neighborly. It was a warning. The family was being fined $100 for an alleged violation of the community rules. The violation, as written in the letter, was almost laughable. A garbage bin had been left visible from the street overnight after collection day. One night, one mistake, yet the HOA treated it as though it were a crime against the community. A breach so grave that it demanded not only financial punishment, but also an implicit reminder of who held the power. The fine was to be paid within 30 days, or further action would be taken. For most people, such a fine would have been irritating but manageable. Pay it, roll the bin behind the fence next time, and move on. But for this family, the principle mattered more than the number. They had worked hard for their home, and they believed in fairness, in common sense, in treating neighbors like humans instead of rule breakers waiting to be punished. The idea of paying $100 for something so trivial felt less like compliance and more like surrender. So the letter was set aside, and with it came the unspoken decision they would not pay. Days passed, and life in the neighborhood carried on with its usual routines. Children rode their bikes in circles, sprinklers sprayed arcs of water across green lawns, and cars pulled in and out of driveways with mechanical regularity. But in the shadows of this normalcy, the HOA board was watching. The unpaid fine did not go unnoticed. Another letter arrived, this one harsher in tone. The fine, it stated, was now delinquent. Late fees had been added. The balance was no longer $100, but $125. The threat of further enforcement actions was underlined. It was clear that the board expected compliance, and expected it quickly. Still, the family refused to yield. Their resolve hardened. They saw the fine as an abuse of power, and the growing late fees as a trap designed to squeeze money from those who either didn't know better or didn't have the energy to fight. Instead of caving, they documented everything. The first letter was photocopied and filed. The second was scanned and saved. A timeline began to form, a record of every attempt the HOA made to flex its authority. By the time the third notice arrived, the balance had ballooned further. The HOA now claimed the family owed over $100. With it came a chilling warning: if the account was not settled immediately, a lien could be placed on the property. It was no longer just about a garbage bin. It was about ownership, about control, about the threat of losing the very roof over their heads because of a petty fine. That had spiraled out of control. The family was stunned by the escalation, but not surprised. They had heard whispers from neighbors about how the HOA operated, stories of others who had faced sudden fines for things as trivial as a lawn ornament being out of place or a car parked an inch too far onto the curb. Some had paid quietly, afraid of confrontation. Others had resisted, only to find themselves buried in paperwork, legal notices, and threats of foreclosure. The HOA thrived on fear, on the assumption that no one would dare to challenge them. But this time, they had chosen the wrong family. With each new notice, the determination to fight grew stronger. The family began researching. They pored over state laws, homeowner rights, and HOA regulations. They discovered clauses buried deep within their community's governing documents, loopholes that the board conveniently ignored when issuing threats. They found precedents in court cases where other homeowners had stood up and won against abusive associations. The more they uncovered, the more they realized the truth. The HOA was not invincible. It relied on intimidation, not legality. Its power was rooted in the assumption that homeowners would not dare to push back, and if someone did, the carefully constructed facade could crack. Still, the pressure mounted. Neighbors began to whisper. Some sided with the HOA, muttering about rule breakers who thought they were above the community. Others offered quiet support, nodding in sympathy, but too afraid to speak up openly. The board, sensing resistance, began to circle closer. Board members slowed their cars when passing the house, jotting notes on clipboards. A notice was taped to the front door, visible for every passerby to see, shaming the family as delinquent. What had started as a $100 fine was now snowballing into something much larger. A battle line had been drawn, not just over money, but over the principle of who truly controlled the home, the family who had bought it, lived in it, and loved it, or the board that claimed authority over every inch of the neighborhood. As the sun set one evening and the family gathered inside, a new letter sat unopened on the kitchen counter. Its envelope was thicker, its weight heavier. This was not another fine. It was something else, something bigger. When it was finally opened, the words inside made the stakes crystal clear. The HOA was beginning proceedings to seize the home, all over a fine that had started at $100. And with that, the war truly began. The counterattack letter lay on the kitchen table like a loaded weapon. Its words were sharp, its message unmistakable. The HOA intended to pursue legal action to seize the family's home. The escalation was breathtaking, almost absurd, yet chillingly real. What had begun as a $100 fine for leaving out a garbage bin had now spiraled into the possibility of losing everything. Shock turned quickly into anger, and anger, in this family, never meant surrender. It meant strategy. The first step was information. Late into the night, laptops glowed in the dimly lit living room as the family combed through documents most homeowners never bothered to read. The HOAS bylaws, covenants, conditions, and restrictions, all the dense, tedious paperwork handed out at the time of purchase suddenly became their battlefield. Page after page revealed contradictions, oversights, and gaps, rules that were selectively enforced, clauses that contradicted state law, language that gave the illusion of authority but crumbled under scrutiny. They soon discovered a critical fact. While the HOA could file liens, the process was not as straightforward as the threatening letters implied. There were strict procedures, notices, and hearings required by state law. Skipping steps rendered the process invalid. Already, the family noticed that some of these requirements had been ignored. Armed with this knowledge, they moved to step 2, documentation. Every letter, every notice, every photocopied page of the HOAS rulebook was organized into binders. Emails were printed, phone calls logged, photographs taken of their property as evidence. They weren't just fighting a board anymore, they were building a case. Word began to spread. At first, it was whispers, then conversations over fences and sidewalks. Neighbors who had once been silent began sharing their own stories. Fines for mailbox paint chipping, threats over seasonal decorations, notices for leaving holiday lights up one day too long. Each story was another piece of evidence, another example of a pattern of abuse. The HOAS power had not come from fairness, but from fear and silence. With quiet determination, the family decided to take the fight public. They drafted a detailed letter to the entire neighborhood, outlining their situation and exposing the HOAS tactics. Copies were slipped discreetly into mailboxes, posted on community forums, and shared through social media. The response was immediate. Some neighbors dismissed it, too afraid or too loyal to the board, but others were outraged, realizing that what happened to one family could easily happen to them. The seeds of resistance had been planted. The HOA did not take kindly to this act of defiance. Within days, new letters arrived, longer, harsher, dripping with legal jargon designed to intimidate. The board accused the family of slander, of spreading misinformation, of destabilizing the community. They demanded a retraction. But this time, the threats rang hollow. The family had done their homework, and the law was on their side. The next move was bold. The family hired an attorney known for taking on corrupt HOA letters. The attorney wasn't just a legal expert, he was a strategist, someone who had seen firsthand how these associations preyed on homeowners. and how quickly their empires crumbled under scrutiny. With his guidance, a formal response was drafted and delivered. The letter challenged the validity of the fines, highlighted procedural violations, and warned the HOA that any further attempt to seize the property would result in a countersuit. The effect was immediate. For the first time, the HOA hesitated. The tone of their letters shifted from arrogant commands to cautious reminders. But the family knew better than to mistake hesitation for surrender. The board was regrouping, recalculating, preparing its next move. Meanwhile, the neighborhood itself was changing. At community meetings, once sparsely attended, more and more residents began showing up. They asked questions, raised concerns, and demanded explanations. The board members, who once sat smugly at the front of the room, now faced sharp stares and restless murmurs. Control was slipping through their fingers, and they knew it. Still, the HOA tried one more tactic: intimidation through spectacle. A notice was taped to the family's front door in bold letters, visible to everyone who passed by. It declared the family delinquent, accused them of being bad neighbors, and threatened foreclosure proceedings. It was meant to shame, to isolate, to break their will, but instead, it backfired. Neighbors who had remained neutral began to see the board's true colors. To target a family so aggressively over such a trivial fine was not the act of a responsible governing body, it was the act of bullies, desperate to maintain control. Quietly, support grew. More neighbors slipped notes of encouragement into the family's mailbox. Some dropped off copies of their own HOA letters. Others whispered promises of help if things escalated further. The family realized something profound. This was no longer just their fight. It had become a movement, a rebellion against an abusive system that had gone unchecked for far too long. Late one night, as the neighborhood lay silent, the family gathered around their dining table. The binders of evidence were stacked high, their attorney's guidance fresh in their minds, and their neighbors' support strengthening their resolve. They knew the HOA wasn't done. There would be more threats, more letters, more attempts to break them. But they were no longer afraid. They were ready. The HOA had chosen the wrong family. And soon, they would realize just how big of a mistake that was. The next morning, as the sun rose over the cul-de-sac, a new letter was delivered to the HOA office, this one from the family's attorney. It was not a response. It was a warning. The war had officially entered a new phase. Escalation letter from the attorney hit the HOA board like a thunderclap. For years, they had operated with unchecked authority, wielding fines and threats as weapons of control. Homeowners, too intimidated to resist, had either paid quietly or endured shame in silence. But this time, their usual tactics had not only failed, they had backfired. Yet instead of retreating, the board doubled down. Within a week, the family received a new notice, this time thicker and wrapped in the trappings of legal formality. Inside were pages of alleged violations dating back months, even years. Grass height exceeding limits by half an inch. A car tire resting slightly on the curb. Seasonal decorations left up beyond the approved time frame. Each claim was absurd. Nitpicking details so small they would have been laughable if not for the sinister intent behind them. The message was clear. If the family wanted a war, the HOA would bury them in paper and technicalities. But the family had anticipated this move. Every binder of documentation, every photograph of their lawn, every receipt for yard services had been meticulously saved. The attorney dissected each claim with surgical precision, drafting rebuttals and exposing the board's inconsistencies. For every accusation, there was evidence to the contrary. What the HOA thought would overwhelm the family instead became fuel for their counterattack. Meanwhile, the board's behavior began to grow desperate. Members started circling the street in their cars, slowing near the family's home as though hunting for new infractions. Notes were taken, photographs snapped, and whispers exchanged at community gatherings. It was surveillance masked as enforcement, and the neighbors noticed. Whispers of discontent turned into conversations. Conversations turned into murmurs of rebellion. The family's earlier letter had planted seeds, and now those seeds began to sprout. Residents who had long tolerated the HOA's overreach started to question why they allowed a handful of board members to dictate their lives. Why were fines issued for trivialities while real issues like potholes in the street or broken lights at the park went ignored? Why was money being funneled into legal battles instead of improvements? The HOA, sensing this shift, tried to regain control through intimidation at meetings. They projected authority, raised their voices, and warned of community decline if rules were not enforced. But the more they spoke, the more transparent their fear became. Attendance swelled at each gathering, with neighbors no longer silent in their seats but vocal, demanding answers. The board's once unshakable authority was eroding under the weight of scrutiny. Then came the most audacious move yet. The HOA attempted to place a lien on the family's home. The paperwork was filed hastily, riddled with procedural flaws, but it was enough to send shockwaves through the neighborhood. If successful, the lien would give the whole leverage to force foreclosure. All of this over a fine that had started at $100. The family's attorney pounced. He filed motions to challenge the lien, citing violations of state law and procedural missteps. He demanded discovery of the HOA's financial records, a request that sent the board scrambling. If granted, those records could reveal years of questionable fines, unexplained expenses, and perhaps even misuse of funds for the first time. The HOA found itself on defense as the legal skirmish unfolded. The neighborhood's mood shifted further. Supporters of the family grew louder, emboldened by the knowledge that someone was finally standing up to the board. Signs of quiet rebellion appeared. More homeowners refused to pay minor fines. Others began attending meetings armed with questions and printouts of state statutes. The once docile community was awakening, but the HOA was not ready to concede. In an act of raw intimidation, they hired private security to patrol the neighborhood. The guards claimed to be there for safety, but their presence was clearly targeted. They parked near the family's home, shined flashlights at their property at night, and wrote down license plates of visitors. It was harassment disguised as enforcement, a show of power meant to break their will. The family, however, refused to cower. Instead of retreating, they documented every instance of harassment: photographs, videos, time-stamped logs. They filed complaints with local authorities. They shared evidence with neighbors, who began to see the board's actions for what they truly were: the desperate flailing of bullies, trying to hold onto power. Tension in the neighborhood reached a boiling point. At the next HOA meeting, the room was packed. Residents, who had never before spoken in public, now stood and voiced their outrage. They demanded accountability, transparency, and an end to the reckless war the board was waging with community funds. The board members, cornered and defensive, lashed out. They accused the family of dividing the neighborhood, of wasting resources, of destabilizing harmony. But their words fell flat. The tide had turned. The residents no longer feared them, they questioned them. And as the meeting ended in chaos, one truth became undeniable. The HOA had underestimated not only the family, but the power of a united community. Still, the board was not done. Behind closed doors, they plotted their next move. If they could not silence the family with fines, liens, or intimidation, they would resort to something even bigger, something designed to destroy their credibility entirely. The battle for the home was now a war for the soul of the neighborhood, and it was far from over. The smear campaign boardroom lights burned late into the night, casting shadows across stacks of papers and whispered conversations. The HOA board, cornered and humiliated, had reached a breaking point. Their threats had failed. Their lien had been challenged. Their attempts at intimidation had only united the neighborhood against them. And so, in their desperation, they chose a darker path. If they could not silence the family through legal and financial pressure, they would destroy them through reputation. The smear campaign began subtly. At first, it was murmurs spread during casual encounters on the sidewalks. Neighbors would hear suggestions that the family was problematic, that they were stirring up trouble for personal gain. Board members, hiding behind smiles, hinted that the family wasn't paying dues, that they were freeloaders who lived at the expense of everyone else. Lies, whispered often enough, began to spread like smoke through the community. But whispers were only the beginning. Soon, anonymous flyers appeared tucked under windshields and taped to bulletin boards near the neighborhood. At Park, they accused the family of dishonesty, of harassing board members, of wanting to dismantle the HOA entirely and leave the community in chaos. The language was inflammatory, designed to paint the family as radicals rather than homeowners fighting for fairness. The family watched as their reputation was dragged through the mud. Friends they had once waved to from the driveway grew distant. Children who once played freely with their own began to be pulled away by cautious parents. The board's plan was working: isolate, vilify, and discredit. Yet the family refused to retreat. For every accusation, they had proof of the truth. The binders of evidence, once used to counter fines, now became shields against lies. They documented every false claim, tracked the origins of the flyers, and gathered testimonies from neighbors who knew the board's tactics all too well. Slowly, they began dismantling the campaign piece by piece, but the smear campaign escalated further. A post appeared on a local community forum, written under a fake account, but dripping with the board's familiar venom. It accused the family of owing thousands in unpaid dues, of threatening lawsuits against neighbors, of planning to sell their home and leave everyone else with skyrocketing costs. The post spread rapidly, shared by those eager for gossip, believed by those too weary to fact-check. It was the lowest point of the battle. For the first time, the family felt the sting of doubt. Would their neighbors believe the lies? Would their reputation ever recover, even if they won in court? The war was no longer just about their home, it was about their name, their integrity, their standing in the place they had built their lives. But then, something unexpected happened. Neighbors who had remained silent for too long began to speak. A retired couple stepped forward, sharing how the HOA had fined them for planting flowers without approval. A young family recounted how they were threatened for leaving toys in the yard. Story after story surfaced, each one painting the board not as protectors of the community, but as predators exploiting it. One by one, these neighbors rallied behind the family, not in whispers but in public. They attended meetings, confronted board members, and posted rebuttals online. The lies that had once spread like wildfire now began to wither under the weight of truth. The family realized they had more than just evidence, they had allies. Meanwhile, the legal battle pressed on. The attorney pressed the board for financial records, demanding to see where the HOAs money had gone. Resistance was fierce, but cracks began to show. Rumors swirled that the board's treasurer had resigned suddenly. Whispers suggested that funds had been mismanaged, perhaps even misused. What began as a fight over a garbage bin fine was now peeling back layers of corruption that stretched far deeper. And so the smear campaign, instead of destroying the family, backfired spectacularly. Every attack only exposed the board's desperation. Every false claim only rallied more neighbors to the cause. The family, once isolated, now found themselves at the center of a growing movement for change. The turning point came at another HOA meeting, one more packed than any before. The board attempted to continue their narrative, painting the family as troublemakers. But the crowd would not have it. Neighbors interrupted, demanding proof. They questioned finances, demanded transparency, and openly accused the board of wasting resources on personal vendettas. The board's control was slipping faster than ever, and as the family watched from their seats, they realized something powerful. The HOA was no longer fighting them alone. They were fighting the entire neighborhood. Still, victory was not yet certain. The smear campaign, though weakened, had left scars. The legal fight loomed large, with court dates approaching and stakes higher than ever. The board, though wounded, was still dangerous. Like a cornered animal, it would not go down without one final, vicious strike. The family braced themselves, knowing the worst was still to come. The HOA had played nearly every card, but there was one left. One desperate move that would test everything the family had built. And when it came, it would change the war forever. The final strike. The board was unraveling. But desperation has a way of turning weakness into recklessness. They had tried intimidation. They had tried piling on violations. They had tried smearing the family's name across every mailbox and message board in the neighborhood. None of it had worked. If anything, their attacks had strengthened the resistance forming against them. But a cornered opponent is often the most dangerous. And so the HOA prepared its final strike. The family's attorney had warned them this might come. He explained that, even without proper cause, some boards would try to bulldoze homeowners into submission. By fast-tracking foreclosure proceedings, it was costly, messy, and often doomed to fail in court, but the mere act of filing could cause panic. Many homeowners, terrified at the thought of losing their home, would give up before the process even began. And then, one morning, it happened. The envelope was heavier than the rest, marked with official insignia. Inside were documents that cut straight to the bone. The HOA had filed paperwork seeking foreclosure over the disputed fines. What had begun as a $100 penalty for a trash bin had now become an existential threat to the family's very home. Shock gave way to fury, but fury quickly hardened into resolve. They had prepared for this moment. Every binder of evidence, every record of harassment, every witness statement from neighbors, they all had a purpose. The attorney was ready. The family was ready. The board thought this final strike would break them, but instead, it ignited them. Word of the foreclosure attempt spread quickly through the neighborhood. And this time, the community did not sit quietly. Residents who had long stayed neutral were appalled. Even those who had once sided with the HOA balked at the idea of throwing a family out of their home over a petty fine. Driveway conversations turned into open outrage. Signs began appearing on lawns. Stop the HOA abuse. Homes are not hostages. The neighborhood was no longer a silent backdrop, it had become a battlefield. The family's attorney filed an immediate response, citing multiple violations of due process. He exposed the board's failure to follow state-mandated procedures, highlighted contradictions in their filings, and accused them of abusing their power. He demanded a full audit of the HOA's finances, pushing the fight beyond the family's home and into the heart of the board's operations. Behind closed doors, the HOA panicked. The smear campaign had failed. The intimidation had backfired. And now, the threat of exposing their finances loomed like a storm cloud. Whispers of mismanagement grew louder. Rumors of funds used for personal expenses, questionable contracts, and hidden kickbacks swirled through the neighborhood. The board's armor was cracking, and everyone could see it. But instead of retreating, the HOA clung tighter to their last weapon. They pressed forward with foreclosure, hoping that sheer momentum might overwhelm the family before the truth could fully surface. They hired aggressive attorneys of their own, sent more letters dripping with legal jargon, and attempted to scare the family into submission. Yet at every turn, the family countered. Their attorney filed motions. Neighbors submitted statements. Evidence piled higher and higher against the board. What had begun as a personal battle was now transforming into a public trial of the HOA itself. And still, the harassment continued. Security cars lingered near the family's home. Anonymous notes were left in their mailbox, warning them to stop fighting. Flyers reappeared, this time claiming the family was costing everyone else money by dragging out the battle. But each attack only deepened the neighborhood's resentment toward the board. Finally, the confrontation reached its climax at a special community meeting. Word had spread, and nearly every homeowner in the subdivision attended. The board attempted to justify the foreclosure, painting the family as defiant rule breakers. But the crowd erupted in outrage. Residents shouted questions about finances, demanded resignations, and accused the board of wasting dues on personal vendettas. The family sat quietly, watching as the board's own neighbors turned against them. They didn't need to speak, the truth had already spoken for them. The board's authority, once unquestioned, was collapsing under the weight of its own greed and arrogance. But the war was not yet over. The foreclosure case still loomed in court, and the board was clinging desperately to the hope of salvaging control. The family knew the coming weeks would decide everything: their home, their reputation, and the future of the community. As they left the chaotic meeting that night, the family looked around at the neighbors who had once been strangers but were now allies. The fight had grown larger than themselves. It was no longer about one fine, one family, or even one home. It was about freedom from a system that had bullied them all for too long. The board had played its final strike, and soon the court would decide if it had been a death blow or the board's ultimate undoing.